The wind howled over the icy mountains of the Korean peninsula, carrying with it the echoes of distant artillery fire. In the dead of night, a young soldier crouched in a frozen trench, gripping his rifle so tightly that his fingers felt fused to the metal. His breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the bitter air around him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or the cold that made him shake. Maybe it was both. In the eerie silence between explosions, he could hear something even more terrifying. Whispers in the dark, voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, moving like shadows just beyond his line of sight. It was as if the night itself was alive, watching, waiting. For most of the world, the Korean War was a conflict fought between the forces of democracy and communism, a brutal struggle that left the peninsula divided and millions dead. But what if that was only part of the story? What if the real truth was something far more unsettling? Something buried beneath classified reports and forgotten testimonies. There were whispers among the soldiers, stories of things that didn't make sense, events that official histories failed to explain. Soldiers vanishing without a trace, entire units wiped out without a single gunshot heard, and strange sightings in the mountains that left even the bravest men questioning their sanity. One such story comes from an American platoon stationed near the Chosin Reservoir, a place now infamous for one of the most brutal battles of the war. In the winter of 1950, temperatures plunged to a deadly -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons jammed from the cold, and frostbite claimed as many men as enemy bullets. But it wasn't just the enemy they were afraid of. One survivor, Corporal James Dawson, later recounted an incident that still haunted him decades later. His unit had set up camp for the night, deep in the frozen wilderness. The only sound was the crackling of their small fire and the distant boom of artillery in the valley below. Then, without warning, the radios went dead. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. And then they heard it, a low, droning hum, like the sound of 1,000 voices speaking at once, coming from the trees beyond their camp. Dawson and his men gripped their weapons, scanning the darkness. They expected enemy soldiers, maybe a surprise attack. But what stepped out of the trees was something else entirely. He never described exactly what he saw, only that it wasn't human. He said the next few minutes were chaos. The men panicked, some firing blindly into the night, others running in sheer terror. By morning, half the unit was gone. No bodies, no tracks in the snow leading away. Just gone. The official report claimed they had been ambushed by Chinese forces. But Dawson never believed that. They didn't scream, he said in an interview years later. When men die, they scream. These men just disappeared. This wasn't the only strange report to come out of the war. Across the front lines, soldiers on both sides spoke of lights in the sky that moved too fast to be planes, figures that appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye, and eerie sounds that made their blood run cold. One account from a South Korean refugee told of an entire village that vanished overnight. Hundreds of people, gone without a trace, their homes left untouched, as if they had simply ceased to exist. The stories were dismissed as wartime hysteria, the hallucinations of exhausted soldiers pushed to their limits. But what if they weren't? Even high-ranking officials had their own encounters. In declassified documents, American pilots reported being followed by unidentified flying objects over the battlefield, strange crafts that defied all known laws of physics. Some pilots never returned. Their planes were found wrecked, but their bodies were never recovered. The strangest part. Similar reports came from the other side. Soviet and Chinese pilots spoke of the same things. Lights that hovered above their formations, objects that darted between planes with impossible speed, and shadows in the clouds that seemed to watch them. Could all of these stories be dismissed as mere paranoia? Or was there something else happening in Korea, something beyond human understanding? As the war raged on, intelligence agencies scrambled to make sense of the strange occurrences. Secret investigations were launched. Documents were classified. Witnesses were silenced. But some evidence still slipped through the cracks. A handful of soldiers, journalists, and researchers pieced together fragments of the truth. A truth that suggested the Korean War was not just a conflict between nations but a battle between something much older, something hidden in the mountains and forests long before human armies set foot on the land. The question remains: what really happened during the Korean War? Were these simply the hallucinations of men pushed to the brink, or was there something else lurking in the shadows of history? Something that governments to this day do not want us to know. The answers may be buried under decades of secrecy, but if we look closely, the clues are still there. Hidden in forgotten reports, whispered in veterans' confessions, and scattered across the cold, unforgiving landscape of a war that never truly ended. And as we dig deeper, one chilling thought remains. If these things were out there then, are they still out there now? The cold seemed endless. It crept into bones, into thoughts, numbing everything except fear. The soldiers who survived the horrors of the Korean War rarely spoke of the things that truly haunted them. Not the bullets, not the bombs, but the things they couldn't explain. Even decades later, when the war was over and their uniforms were tucked away in dusty closets, some would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing those same eerie sounds from the mountains, the whispers that never faded. Corporal James Dawson had been one of the lucky ones, if you could call it that. He made it home, started a family, tried to live a normal life. But Korea never really let him go. He would sit alone sometimes, staring at the trees outside his window, watching the way the wind moved through the branches. His wife would find him like that, lost in thought, gripping the armrest of his chair as if he were still holding his rifle. And when she asked him what was wrong, he would shake his head. He didn't know how to explain it, not without sounding insane. Dawson wasn't the only one who felt that way. Across America, veterans gathered in dimly lit bars, in VFW halls, in small living rooms where the only company was a half-empty bottle of whiskey. They would talk about the war, but not the official version. The real war. The war that never made it into history books. They spoke in hushed voices, looking over their shoulders as if someone might be listening. Some of them claimed it was just their minds playing tricks on them, the stress of war making them see things that weren't there. But others weren't so sure. One veteran, an ex-Marine named Thomas Grayson, spent years trying to find answers. He had been stationed near the 38th parallel, in a remote outpost where the nights were too quiet, where men disappeared without a sound. He remembered one particular evening when his unit had been on patrol, moving carefully through a dense forest under the cover of darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence, the kind that made a man's skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, his radio crackled to life. At first it was just static, but then there was something else. Voice. It was faint, almost distorted, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The other men in his unit stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. No one was supposed to be on that frequency. And yet, the voice continued, low and rhythmic, as if chanting something. Grayson tried to respond, but the second he pressed the radio button, the voice stopped. The static cut out, leaving nothing but the dead silence of the forest. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped. Not like a normal cold front, this was different. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible force. And that's when they saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the darkness. It wasn't moving, just watching. Grayson called out, demanding a response. No answer. One of his men raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the figure simply vanished, as if it had never been there. The patrol turned back immediately, moving as fast as they could without breaking into a full sprint. When they reached their base, Grayson reported what they had seen. But instead of concern, the officer in charge simply stared at him, unblinking. Then he told him something that made his blood run cold. "Forget it," the officer said. "This never happened." Grayson wanted to protest, but the way the officer looked at him, calm, almost indifferent, made it clear that arguing was useless. Later, he learned that other units had reported similar encounters. Strange lights, missing soldiers, whispers over the radio. And every time they were told the same thing. It never happened. 4 years after the war, Grayson tried to make sense of it. He pored over declassified reports, searched for anything that might explain what he and so many others had experienced. But the more he dug, the more questions he found. Some documents were heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out. Others had simply vanished from government archives, as if they had never existed. One night, while researching at a local library, he came across something that sent a chill down his spine. It was an old Korean folktale, one that had been passed down for generations. It spoke of spirits that lived in the mountains, beings that were neither human nor animal, watchers who moved in the shadows and took those who wandered too far from the villages. The locals called them the Silent Ones. They didn't kill. They simply made people disappear. Could this have been what the soldiers had encountered? Was it some ancient force, something older than the war itself? Or was there something even more terrifying at play? Something the governments of the world knew about but refused to acknowledge? Grayson was never able to find a definitive answer. Some nights, he would sit on his porch, staring into the darkness, listening to the wind. And sometimes just for a moment he thought he could hear them again. The whispers. The ones from the radio. The ones from the forest. The ones that never really left. The truth about the Korean War is far more unsettling than we've been told. The battles, the politics, the destruction. All of that is well documented. But what about the other war? The war that happened in the dead of night, in the frozen forests, in the places where reality itself seemed to bend. There are still veterans who remember. Still places on the Korean peninsula where strange things are said to happen. Where the air grows heavy. Where radios pick up voices that shouldn't be there. Where shadows move just out of sight. And if the Silent Ones were there then, who's to say they aren't still there now? The deeper one looks into the Korean War, the more unsettling the stories become. The war itself was brutal, a relentless struggle between North and South, with foreign powers turning the peninsula into a battleground for their own agendas. But beneath the surface, away from the front lines and the political speeches, something else was happening. Something that even the most hardened soldiers refused to talk about in broad daylight. Take the case of Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a communications officer stationed at an outpost near the Imjin River in early 1951. His job was straightforward: monitor radio transmissions, relay messages, and ensure that communication lines remained open between his unit and command. But one night, as he was scanning frequencies, he picked up something unexpected. At first, it sounded like an ordinary distress call, faint, crackling, just barely coming through the static. The voice on the other end spoke English, but something about it was off. The words were slow, almost slurred, as if the speaker was struggling to form sentences. Mayday. Need assistance. Coordinates. The numbers that followed made no sense. They weren't anywhere near a known military position. Hayes adjusted the dials, trying to get a clearer signal. But as he did, the voice changed. It wasn't garbled anymore. It was repeating the same distress call, but in reverse. Every word spoken backward, as if time itself had bent around the transmission. Cold sweat broke out on his neck. He tried to reply, demanding the caller identify themselves, but there was no response. Only silence. Then, just as he was about to switch channels, something else came through. A whisper. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language he recognized. And it was coming through on every frequency at once. Hayes felt a deep sense of unease. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but this was different. He reported the incident to his commanding officer, who dismissed it outright. Equipment malfunction, they told him. Probably interference from the mountains. But Hayes wasn't convinced. A few days later, he found out that another radio operator stationed miles away had picked up the exact same transmission at the exact same time. Things only got stranger from there. A week later, a reconnaissance unit was sent into a remote valley after aerial surveillance showed movement where there shouldn't have been any. The team was led by Sergeant Michael Carter, a seasoned soldier who had survived some of the worst battles of the war. His orders were simple: investigate, report back, and engage only if necessary. Carter and his men moved cautiously through the thick underbrush, their rifles at the ready. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness that made every footstep sound deafening. Then they found the first sign that something was wrong. In the middle of the valley, where the trees thinned out, there was a clearing. In that clearing, standing perfectly upright, were a dozen rifles, American, Chinese, and North Korean, all planted in the frozen ground. There were no bodies, no signs of a battle, just the weapons arranged in a precise circle, as if placed there deliberately. Carter signaled his men to spread out, searching for any clues. That's when they saw the footprints, or rather the lack of them. The snow was undisturbed, no tracks leading in or out of the clearing. It was as if the rifles had appeared out of thin air. Then the radio crackled. "Turn back," a voice whispered. "Leave now." It wasn't one of their men. The signal was coming from their own frequency, but the voice didn't belong to anyone they recognized. And worse, it was coming from inside their perimeter. One of the soldiers, Private Randall, swore he saw something moving in the trees. Shape. Figure. But the second he pointed it out, it was gone. That was enough for Carter. He ordered his men to fall back, retreating carefully toward their original position. As they left the clearing, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, surrounding them on all sides. They made it back to base just before dawn. Carter filed his report, detailing everything they had seen. But instead of questions, instead of debriefings, he was met with something else. Silence. No one wanted to talk about it. His commanding officer skimmed the report, nodded once, then told him to forget what he saw. The paperwork was classified before it even left the desk. Carter knew better than to ask questions. But later, as he sat alone in his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just stumbled into something. They had been watched. And whoever or whatever it was had wanted them to see. Stories like these weren't rare. They were everywhere. Whispers of missing patrols, of bases that received distress calls from units that no longer existed, of soldiers who returned from missions changed. Distant, hollow-eyed, unable to remember where they had been. Some of them wouldn't speak at all, as if something had taken their voices. Others would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming in languages they had never spoken before. Even the civilians had their own tales. An elderly Korean woman, a refugee from a village near the border, once spoke of a night when the sky opened up. She said a strange light passed over her home, casting no shadow, making no sound. When she woke up the next morning, half the people in her village were gone. No signs of struggle, no explanation, just empty houses, still filled with their belongings, as if they had been abandoned in the middle of the night. And then there was the strangest part of all. The classified reports, the ones buried deep in military archives, mentioned something unusual about the disappearances. The missing weren't just gone. In some cases, their names had vanished from records. Entire units erased as if they had never existed. Even their families back home were told nothing. No letters. No official notifications. Just silence. There was something in Korea. Something the world wasn't meant to see. Something that left its mark on the men who fought there, even after they returned home. And as the years passed, as memories faded and war stories became legend, the truth remained buried. But the whispers never stopped. By the time winter deepened over the Korean peninsula, fear had become a silent companion to the soldiers stationed in the most remote outposts. It wasn't just the enemy they feared anymore. It was the things they couldn't explain. The things that seemed to watch from the darkness, the voices that echoed over their radios when no one was supposed to be there, the strange lights that moved over the hills but left no shadows. Lieutenant Robert Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He had been stationed at an isolated ridge just north of the 38th parallel, where visibility was poor and the night stretched endlessly. The air always seemed too still, and when the wind did blow, It carried with it a sound that was impossible to place. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice. His men had stopped asking questions. They knew better. The ones who spoke too much, the ones who tried to report what they had seen, didn't last long. Some were sent away. Some simply disappeared. One evening, just before sundown, Hayes was called to the command tent. His superior, Captain Reynolds, looked tense, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden table. There was a new assignment, an urgent reconnaissance mission to a valley that had been the source of several distress calls. The problem? The calls were coming from a unit that no longer existed. Their records showed that the unit had been wiped out weeks ago during an ambush. Every man accounted for. Officially no survivors. And yet the calls kept coming, repeating the same cryptic message. They're still here. We can't leave. The unease in the room was thick. Hayes and his team geared up, checking their weapons, strapping on extra ammunition. But deep down, they knew firepower wouldn't protect them from whatever was waiting in that valley. Still, orders were orders. Just before setting out, Hayes caught Captain Reynolds watching him. There was something in his eyes. Something that almost looked like regret. If you see anything, Reynolds said quietly, you come back. No heroics. No reporting. Just come back. The trek to the valley was slow and careful. The landscape was eerily empty, the usual sounds of war, distant gunfire, the rumble of artillery, seeming miles away. As they approached the valley's entrance, Private Randall, the youngest in the group, swore under his breath. The footprints were back. Just like the ones Sergeant Carter had seen weeks earlier. Deep, deliberate impressions in the snow. But no sign of where they led. The radio crackled. Hayes felt his stomach tighten as the same distorted voice whispered through the static. Turn back. Too late. His men looked at him, waiting for his order. He hesitated for only a moment. They pressed forward. The valley opened before them in an unsettling way. The trees were twisted. Their bare branches stretched upward like skeletal hands. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. Then they saw it. Scattered across the valley floor were helmets, boots, rifles, all remnants of the lost unit. But still there were no bodies. No sign of a struggle. And that's when they noticed something else. The equipment wasn't old. The boots weren't covered in ice. The rifles weren't rusted. It was as if these things had been placed there moments before they arrived. Then the shadows shifted. Randall gasped, raising his weapon, but before anyone could react, the world around them seemed to bend. The valley darkened unnaturally, though no clouds covered the sky. The air grew thick, charged with something electric, something alive. Hayes felt his breath catch as figures emerged. Not from the trees, not from the ground, but from the air itself. First they looked like soldiers. American, Korean, Chinese. But their faces were wrong. Hollow. Eyes too dark, mouths moving but producing no sound. The radio screeched again. This time a high-pitched wail that sent a burning pain through Hayes' skull. His men clutched their heads, staggering backward. Then came the voices. Dozens of them whispering at once. Some in English. Some in Korean. Some in languages that didn't belong to this world. They never left. Still here. Still waiting. Hayes raised his weapon, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. These weren't enemy soldiers. These weren't men at all. And as the figures moved closer, reality itself seemed to splinter. The valley stretched and twisted, the snow-covered ground shifting beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder, deafening, consuming. Hayes struggled to stay upright, to focus, but the air pulsed like a living thing. And then, just for a moment, he saw them clearly, the missing. The men who had vanished. Their faces filled with silent horror, trapped in a moment that had never ended. The valley wasn't just a battlefield. It was something else. Something ancient. Something alive. And they were never supposed to find it. Hayes felt the weight of the valley pressing down on him. His breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figures surrounded them now. Silent, unmoving, watching. The faces of the missing men flickered like images on a broken screen, trapped between moments of horror and something far worse, resignation. As if they had accepted their fate long ago. The whispers swelled, overlapping, merging into a sound that was neither human nor natural. Randall was the first to panic. He fired. The gunshot rang through the valley, but the bullet never hit its mark. Simply vanished. Like it had been swallowed by the air itself. Then the figures moved. Not with the jerky, unnatural speed of something inhuman, but slowly, deliberately. As if they were waiting. Hayes gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused. "Fall back," he shouted. The men scrambled, their boots crunching against the snow as they turned toward the tree line. But that's when the second realization hit. The trees, the ones they had walked past just moments ago, were gone. The valley had changed. The path they had taken was no longer there. It was as if the land itself had shifted, closing them in. The radio on Hayes' shoulder crackled again, but this time the voice that came through was different, clearer, stronger. "Lieutenant Hayes." It was Captain Reynolds. But something was wrong. Hayes could hear his own breathing over the radio. His own voice repeating back everything he was saying. "No," Hayes whispered, eyes darting around. "This isn't real." But then something else came through the transmission. Second voice. Distant. "Hello. You were never supposed to find this place." The valley pulsed again, and in that moment, something shifted inside Hayes. He realized the figures weren't closing in on them. They were waiting. He wasn't sure how, but he knew this wasn't an attack. This was a message. A warning. Then came the final shock. One of the figures stepped forward. Unlike the others, his face wasn't distorted, wasn't frozen in agony. His uniform was tattered, but unmistakable. His eyes, though hollow, were unmistakable. It was Carter. The same Sergeant Carter who had led a mission here weeks ago. The same Carter who had been ordered to forget what he saw. The same Carter who was supposed to be back at base. Hayes felt his chest tighten. His mind screamed that this couldn't be possible, but Carter was standing right in front of him. The other men noticed too. Randall's face drained of color. "No," he whispered. "He's back at base. We saw him." Carter opened his mouth, but his voice didn't come from his lips. Came from the radio. "Leave. Now." The figures around them began to shift again, the air distorting like heat rising from pavement. Hayes made a decision. He didn't question it. Didn't hesitate. "Move," he shouted. The men bolted, pushing through the unnatural fog, forcing their way toward where the tree line should have been. The whispers followed them, but the figures didn't. And then, just like that, it was over. They stumbled forward, nearly collapsing as they emerged into the clearing where their mission had started. The valley was gone. Behind them the land was normal. No strange formations, no figures, no remnants of the missing. Just trees and snow and the distant hum of the war still raging beyond the hills. They didn't speak on the way back. No one asked questions. No one dared. But when they returned to base, something was wrong. The moment Hayes stepped into the command tent, Captain Reynolds looked up, his face pale. "What the hell are you doing here?" Hayes frowned. "What do you mean?" Reynolds swallowed hard, his hands gripping the table. "Your team never left. You were here the whole time." Hayes shook his head. "That's not possible. We just got back." Reynolds motioned to the radio operator. The man hesitated, then flipped a switch. The recording played. Hayes' voice clear as day, speaking as if he had never left the base. Giving status updates. Answering roll calls. Hayes' blood ran cold. Somewhere, deep in the valley they had escaped from, something else had taken their place. Hayes stood frozen in the command tent, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just heard. The radio recording played back his own voice, calm, composed, as if he had never set foot outside the base. But that wasn't possible. He could still feel the cold of the valley on his skin, still hear the whispers crawling through his mind. His men were just as shaken, their faces pale, eyes darting around as if expecting something to pull them back. Reynolds wasn't convinced. "I don't know what's going on here, Lieutenant," he said. His voice measured but firm. "But if you've been here this whole time, then who the hell went into that valley?" The word sent a chill down Hayes' spine. He turned to look at his men, their expressions mirroring his own confusion. Randall took a step forward. "We were there. We saw Carter." The room went silent. Reynolds' face darkened. "That's not possible," he muttered. Hayes clenched his fists. "Why not?" Reynolds hesitated before answering. "Because Carter never came back from his mission." He exhaled sharply, looking like a man who had just decided to break a rule he swore to keep. "We told you he was back at base. We had to. Orders." The weight of those words settled over Hayes like a crushing force. He felt sick. They had all seen Carter in the weeks before. Spoke to him. Ate beside him. But if Carter had never come back from the valley, then what had been living among them? Randall took a step back, shaking his head. "Oh. No, that's not." Before he could finish, the base lights flickered. A sharp burst of static crackled through the radio. And then a voice. His own voice. "You were never supposed to leave." The tent plunged into chaos. Reynolds barked orders, demanding an immediate communications lockdown, but it was too late. The air had changed, thickened. That same heavy stillness from the valley was here now, inside the base. Hayes turned to his men, but something was wrong. Randall's face was slack, his eyes unfocused. The others stood eerily still. A cold wave of realization washed over him. Their bodies were here, but had they really made it back? Then he heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from outside the tent. Reynolds grabbed his sidearm, motioning for Hayes to follow. They pushed outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. But the base was different. The perimeter lights flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows. The sound of distant voices, layered over one another, filled the air. Then they saw it. Standing at the edge of the base was Carter, or something that looked like Carter. His face was just a little off. His features too smooth, his eyes too empty. He stood motionless, staring. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light, were more figures. Soldiers. Some wearing uniforms from decades ago. Some with faces half-formed, as if they had been pulled from a memory and left unfinished. Reynolds raised his weapon. "Stand down." Carter, if it was still him, tilted his head as if trying to understand the words. Then, in a voice that was almost human, he spoke. "You were never supposed to leave." Hayes' blood ran cold. The figures took a step forward, moving as one. The whispers grew louder, curling around them like smoke. The base itself seemed to waver, as if reality was struggling to hold its shape. Hayes realized the truth too late. They had never really left the valley. Whatever had come back with them wasn't them at all. Hayes' breath came in short, panicked bursts. The truth had settled over him like a weight he could never shake off. They had never really left the valley. Or maybe something had followed them out. He turned to Reynolds, who was gripping his weapon so tightly his knuckles were white. But what good would a gun do against something like this? The figures were closing in, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Carter, or the thing wearing Carter's face, stood at the front, watching Hayes with a look that was almost patient. The words echoed again, though the lips barely moved. "You were never supposed to leave." Hayes clenched his fists. "Then why let us go?" His own voice barely sounded like his. The figures didn't answer, but the air pulsed again, thick with something unseen. The whispers had become an unbearable hum, crawling under his skin, clawing at his thoughts. His mind felt stretched, like reality itself was beginning to unravel. He turned to Reynolds, but the captain was staring at something in the distance, past the figures, past the base. His eyes were wide with something between terror and realization. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the valley was there again. Not in front of them, not as a physical place, but all around them. The snow, the twisted trees, the helmets scattered in the frost. It had never been left behind. It had never let them go. The base, the tents, the people. It was all an illusion, a trick played on their minds. Hayes staggered back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered. "No, we got out. We made it back." Carter, if that's who he had ever been, took another step forward. "Did you?" Hayes wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but the truth was sinking in. The memories of the return trip, the radio transmission, the way things had felt off since they had arrived. Nothing was real. His body felt numb as realization gripped him. They had never escaped. They had only been shown what they wanted to see. Randall let out a broken sound, something between a sob and a scream. He grabbed his rifle and fired round after round, but the bullets never met their targets. The figures didn't flinch, didn't move. The whispers surged again, wrapping around Hayes, filling his mind with things he wasn't meant to understand. Then came the final break. The light changed. The sky above them flickered like a film reel skipping frames. For the briefest second, Hayes saw the base again. Saw soldiers going about their duties, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just beneath their feet. And then it was gone, replaced once more by the valley. The figures had stopped moving. They weren't coming closer anymore. They were waiting. Hayes swallowed hard, forcing himself to think past the panic clawing at his throat. "What do you want?" His voice cracked as he asked the question, but he needed to know. Carter, or whatever remained of him, tilted his head again. The whispers softened. Then, at last, came the answer. "To be remembered." The word sent a chill through Hayes' bones, but this time it wasn't fear. It was understanding. The valley wasn't a trap. It wasn't hunting them. It wasn't trying to claim them. It was showing them something no one had ever been allowed to see. The lost, the forgotten, the soldiers who had vanished without a trace. They had never left this place. And no one had ever come back to tell their stories. Hayes took a slow breath. He looked at Carter, really looked at him. His face wasn't twisted in malice, wasn't wearing the grin of something evil. There was sorrow in his hollow eyes, a desperate need to be seen, to be known. Hayes lowered his weapon. Reynolds stared at him, confused, but Hayes just shook his head. "We were never supposed to leave," he repeated, understanding at last. "Because no one else ever did." The valley pulsed again, the edges of it fraying, flickering. The whispers became words, overlapping voices calling out. Names, memories, last words spoken in battle. Hayes felt them pressing into his mind, not as an attack, but as a plea to not be erased. He nodded once. "We won't forget." The moment the words left his lips, everything shifted. The cold eased. The heavy weight pressing on his chest lifted. The air cleared. And suddenly they were back. The base was real again. The lights were steady. The air smelled of oil and gunpowder. Soldiers moved around as if nothing had happened. But something was different. Hayes could feel it. The weight in his mind, the names that had burned themselves into his thoughts, the faces he had seen. He would never forget them. Reynolds let out a shaky breath, looking around. "Did we just?" Hayes didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the ridge, where the valley had been. It was gone now. Just another stretch of snow-covered land. Silent. But he knew better. It would always be there, waiting. Not for revenge. Not for fear. Just to be remembered.